I never liked clowns. Maybe it was the painted-on smiles or the unnatural cheeriness, but something about them always felt off. I suppose that's why, when the circus came to Ridgemont, I had a bad feeling right from the start. My name is Jeff Whitaker, and I work as a journalist for the local paper, the Ridgemont Gazette. Ridgemont is a small town in upstate New York, one of those places where everyone knows everyone. So when the circus set up camp just outside town, it was the biggest thing to happen here in years. The children were excited, the parents nostalgic, and even I was a little curious. But that curiosity quickly turned into something else. The first night of the circus was packed. People from all over the county came to see the show. I was there, not because I particularly wanted to be, but because my editor thought it would make a good story. The circus was everything you'd expect. Acrobats, fire breathers, a ringmaster with a booming voice, and of course, clowns. They were everywhere, juggling, miming, pulling endless strings of handkerchiefs from their sleeves. But there was one clown that caught my eye, and not in a good way. He was standing near the entrance, away from the rest of the performers, his back turned to the crowd. His costume was like the others, bright colors, oversized shoes, and a ruffled collar. But his makeup was different. It was almost too perfect, like a mask. His face was white as snow, with deep black around the eyes, and a blood-red smile that seemed more sinister than joyful. I couldn't see his eyes. They were hidden under a shadow, despite the lights from the circus blazing around us. Something about him made my skin crawl, so I decided to avoid him and focus on the main event. But as I was leaving that night, I saw him again, standing in the exact same spot, still as a statue. I thought about approaching him, maybe for a quick interview, but something in my gut told me to stay away. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of phone calls. 3 children had gone missing overnight, all of them last seen at the circus. The town was in a panic, and I was assigned to cover the story. As I interviewed parents, searched for leads, and wrote up reports, that clown kept creeping into my mind. By the 3rd day, the mood in Ridgemont had shifted from excitement to dread. The circus continued its performances, but the crowds were thinner, and the air was thick with fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that the clown had something to do with the disappearances. So I decided to dig deeper. I spent hours combing through old newspapers and records, trying to find any information on this circus. What I found was chilling. The circus had appeared in small towns all across the country, always following the same pattern. They would set up, perform for a few nights, and then leave. And every time without fail, children would go missing. I brought my findings to the local police, but they brushed me off, saying it was just a coincidence. I knew better. That night, I went back to the circus, determined to confront the clown. The circus grounds were almost deserted when I arrived. The tents loomed like shadows against the night sky, and the only sound was the distant call of a lone trumpet. I made my way to the spot where I'd seen the clown standing, but he wasn't there. The unease I felt had grown into full-blown fear, but I pressed on. As I wandered through the empty tents, I heard something. A faint giggle, high-pitched and eerie. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, until I found myself in front of the funhouse. The entrance was a grinning clown's mouth, wide open as if to swallow me whole. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. Inside, the funhouse was a maze of mirrors and dark corridors. My reflection stared back at me from every angle, distorted and twisted. The giggling grew louder, echoing off the walls, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I was lost, both physically and mentally, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Then I saw him, the clown from the entrance, standing at the end of a long hallway. He wasn't moving, just watching me, his head cocked to one side as if he were studying me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I slowly walked toward him. "Where are they?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted one hand and pointed to a door behind him. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed past him and opened the door. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. The room was filled with old circus memorabilia, posters, costumes, props. But in the center was something far more disturbing. There were 3 small coffins, each one painted in bright circus colors. My breath caught in my throat as I approached them, knowing what I would find inside. The clown hadn't followed me. He stayed in the hallway, his back to me, as if this part of the nightmare was too much even for him. I forced myself to look into the coffins. They were empty, but that didn't bring any comfort. I knew what they were for. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the lock click. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The clown's laughter echoed around me, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. The walls seemed to close in, the circus props turning into grotesque shapes in the dim light. My heart raced, my breaths came in short gasps, and I felt the world spinning around me. Then, as suddenly as it started, the laughter stopped. Silence fell, thick and heavy, as I turned to face the door. Slowly, it creaked open, revealing the hallway once more. But the clown was gone. I stumbled out of the room, desperate to escape, and found myself back at the entrance of the funhouse. I didn't stop running until I was out of the circus grounds, back in the relative safety of my car. The circus left town the next morning, and with it, any hope of finding the missing children. The police continued their search, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. The circus was gone, and so were the children. I left Ridgemont not long after that, unable to stay in the town where the horrors of that night still haunted me. I've spent years trying to forget, but I can't. The image of that clown, with his frozen smile and empty eyes, is burned into my mind. I heard recently that the circus has set up in another small town, and once again, children have gone missing. I want to warn them, to tell them to stay away, but I know it's useless. The circus will move on, just as it always has, leaving a trail of broken families and unanswered questions in its wake. And the clown, he'll be there, waiting for his next audience, his next victims. It all started with a small flyer on a weathered bulletin board outside of a dilapidated diner on the outskirts of Milton, Ohio. Carnival coming to town, it proclaimed in vibrant, almost childish handwriting, complete with doodles of balloons, cotton candy, and smiling clowns. It was a peculiar sight in a town like Milton, where the most exciting event in years had been the opening of a new gas station. Rachel Whitman was the first to notice the flyer, and like everyone else, she was curious. Milton was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, so the arrival of a carnival was a big deal. She snapped a picture of the flyer and sent it to her best friend, Jason Carter, with the caption, "Finally, something fun." Jason, who had lived in Milton his entire life, was less enthusiastic. "Carnivals are creepy," he texted back, "especially ones that just show up out of nowhere." Rachel brushed off his concern. "Don't be a buzzkill. Jace, let's go check it out." When the day finally arrived, the sky was overcast, casting a dull gray hue over the town. The carnival set up on the edge of the forest that bordered Milton, its colorful tents a stark contrast against the dark backdrop of trees. The air was thick with the scent of popcorn and sugar, mingling with the dampness of the impending rain. Rachel and Jason arrived at dusk, just as the lights flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the carnival grounds. The place was surprisingly empty, save for a few scattered groups of people, mostly families with young children. They wandered through the carnival, playing rigged games and eating overpriced snacks. Despite the cheerful music and bright lights, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The clowns that roamed the grounds, offering balloon animals and exaggerated smiles, seemed a little too interested in them. Their eyes, hidden behind layers of garish makeup, followed the pair wherever they went. "Let's go on the Ferris wheel," Rachel suggested, pointing to the towering structure that loomed over the carnival. Jason hesitated, but followed her lead. They climbed into one of the rickety carriages, and the ride began its slow ascent. As they reached the top, the view of the carnival grounds below them was surreal. The colorful tents and blinking lights were swallowed by the dense forest surrounding the area. The air felt colder up there, and Jason shivered, though it wasn't just the temperature that chilled him. Suddenly, the Ferris wheel jerked to a stop, leaving them suspended at the top. The lights flickered, and the music from below warbled before cutting out completely. A silence as thick as the fog rolled in, enveloping the carnival in an oppressive stillness. "Great," Rachel muttered. "Just our luck." Jason's eyes were drawn to the edge of the forest. In the dim light, he could see shadows moving, figures emerging from the trees. At first, he thought they were other carnival goers, maybe more workers. But as they stepped closer, he realized with a sinking feeling that they were clowns. These clowns were different from the ones they'd seen earlier. Their clothes were tattered, their makeup smeared and grotesque. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their heads twitching from side to side as if they were listening for something. "Rachel," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "Look." She followed his gaze and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What the hell?" The clowns gathered at the base of the Ferris wheel, staring up at them with those same unnerving, painted-on smiles. One of them, taller than the rest and dressed in a stained, tattered yellow suit, raised a hand and pointed directly at them. The Ferris wheel jolted again, sending their carriage into a wild spin. Rachel screamed, clutching the metal bar in front of her as they were flung back and forth. The ride descended with terrifying speed, and when they finally hit the ground, the impact knocked the wind out of them. Dazed and disoriented, Jason stumbled out of the carriage, pulling Rachel with him. The carnival grounds were deserted now, the cheerful music replaced by an eerie silence. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. "We need to get out of here," Jason said, his voice hoarse with fear. Rachel nodded, too shaken to speak. They ran through the empty carnival, past the silent game stalls and darkened rides, but no matter which direction they went, they always seemed to end up back at the Ferris wheel. "This isn't right," Rachel panted, her eyes wide with panic. "We're trapped." Jason felt the same sense of dread gnawing at him. It was as if the carnival had shifted, become a maze with no exit. The shadows between the tents seemed to stretch and move, hiding unseen terrors. They heard the sound of footsteps behind them, slow, deliberate, heavy. Jason turned around, and there they were, the clowns, slowly closing in on them from all sides. There was no escape. "Rachel, run!" Jason shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her towards a gap between the tents. They sprinted through the opening, emerging into what should have been the parking lot. But instead of cars and safety, they found themselves in the forest, the carnival now completely gone, as if it had never been there at all. The clowns followed, their laughter echoing through the trees. It was a high-pitched, maniacal sound that made Jason's blood run cold. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of a small clearing, where an old, decrepit circus wagon sat in the center. The door was ajar, and from inside, they could hear the faint sound of carnival music playing on a loop. "We can't stop," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to keep going." But Jason was already moving toward the wagon, something compelling him to look inside. Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open wider. Inside, the wagon was filled with old, dusty clown costumes, faded posters, and broken carnival equipment. But what caught Jason's attention was a mirror at the far end of the room. It was tall, with an ornate frame that looked out of place among the clutter. Jason approached the mirror, his reflection distorted and wavy. For a moment, he thought he saw something behind him, a figure standing just out of view. He turned around, but the wagon was empty. "Jason?" Rachel's voice was filled with fear. He looked back at the mirror, and this time, the figure was clear. It was a clown, its face a horrific mask of smeared makeup and empty eyes. The clown's hand reached out, pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. Jason stumbled back, but it was too late. The glass shattered, and the clown lunged forward, pulling him into the mirror. He felt a cold, crushing pressure as he was dragged into the darkness. Rachel screamed his name, but Jason was already gone, lost to the mirror and the nightmare world on the other side. The last thing he saw was the reflection of the clown, smiling down at him as everything went black. Back in Milton, the carnival had disappeared by morning, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. The townspeople searched the woods for days, but found nothing. No tents, no rides, and no sign of Rachel or Jason. The only thing left behind was a single torn flyer pinned to the bulletin board at the diner. The words, "Carnival coming to town," were barely legible, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. The day started like any other in the quiet town of Riverside. The summer heat clung to the air, making the streets shimmer under the sun's relentless glare. The residents went about their routines, blissfully unaware of the dark shadow that was about to be cast over their peaceful lives. Emily Harris was a single mother, raising her 6-year-old son, Danny, on her own. Life hadn't been easy since her husband passed away in a car accident 2 years ago, but she had managed to keep it together for Danny's sake. They had recently moved to Riverside, hoping for a fresh start in a town that promised safety and serenity. But safety was a fleeting illusion. It all started with the flyers. One morning, as Emily was walking Danny to school, they noticed a bright, colorful flyer stapled to a telephone pole. "The amazing Mr. Jingles," it read, "coming to Riverside Park this Saturday. Free show. Fun for the whole family." The flyer featured a picture of a clown with a wide grin, his red nose almost glowing against his white-painted face. Danny's eyes lit up. "Can we go, Mom, please?" Emily hesitated. She wasn't fond of clowns, finding them more unsettling than amusing. But Danny had been through so much lately, and she didn't want to dampen his excitement. "Sure, sweetie," she said, forcing a smile. "We'll go." Saturday arrived, and Riverside Park was buzzing with anticipation. Families gathered on the grassy field, children running around with balloons and cotton candy. The stage was set up near the park's center, a small, makeshift structure with a red curtain that billowed in the breeze. Emily and Danny found a spot near the front, where Danny sat cross-legged, his eyes glued to the stage. The show began with typical clown antics, balloon animals, juggling, and silly pranks. But there was something off about Mr. Jingles. His movements were too sharp, his grin too wide. When he spoke, his voice was high-pitched, almost shrill, and his jokes seemed to teeter on the edge of cruelty. As the show progressed, Emily noticed that the other parents were growing uneasy. The children, however, were enthralled. Danny, in particular, was mesmerized by Mr. Jingles, laughing at every gag, no matter how bizarre. Emily reached out to touch his shoulder, but he didn't react. His eyes were glazed over, locked on the clown as if in a trance. Then, without warning, Mr. Jingles stopped mid-performance. He stood perfectly still, his grin fading. The audience fell silent, a sense of dread settling over the crowd. Mr. Jingles raised his arm and pointed directly at Danny. "You," he said, his voice echoing through the park. "You want to have fun, don't you, Danny?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. How did he know her son's name? She looked around, hoping someone else had noticed, but the other parents were just as frozen as their children. "Come up here, Danny," Mr. Jingles beckoned. "I have a special surprise for you." Before Emily could react, Danny stood up and started walking toward the stage, his steps mechanical, as if he were being pulled by an invisible force. Emily shot up from her seat, panic rising in her chest. "Danny, no!" she cried. But her voice was drowned out by the sound of the audience erupting into applause, as if they were under some collective spell. Mr. Jingles reached down and took Danny's hand, pulling him up onto the stage. "Let's play a game," the clown said, his grin returning, wider than ever. Emily pushed through the crowd, desperate to reach her son. But as she approached the stage, something changed. The air around her grew cold, and the colors of the park seemed to drain away, leaving everything in shades of gray. The laughter of the audience twisted into a distorted, nightmarish cackle. And then she saw it, the true face of Mr. Jingles. His painted smile melted away, revealing a gaping maw filled with rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. His eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to swallow the light. He wasn't a clown. He was something far worse, something ancient and malevolent. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. She could only watch in horror as Mr. Jingles wrapped his long, skeletal fingers around Danny's shoulders. The stage began to warp and shift, the ground beneath it splitting open to reveal a swirling abyss. "Time to go, Danny," Mr. Jingles whispered, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. "No!" Emily lunged forward, but it was too late. The stage collapsed into the abyss, taking Mr. Jingles and Danny with it. The darkness closed in around them, and then, with a deafening roar, the ground sealed shut. Emily fell to her knees, the world spinning around her. The park was empty, silent. The audience, the stage, Mr. Soft Jingles, they were all gone. Only the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees remained. And so did Danny's laughter. But it wasn't a joyful sound. It was twisted, corrupted, echoing from somewhere deep within the earth. Emily searched the park frantically, calling out her son's name, but there was no answer. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty field. She knew she wouldn't find him, not here, not in this world. Danny was gone, taken by the thing that wore the mask of a clown. In the weeks that followed, Emily refused to leave Riverside. She became a ghost herself, haunting the park day and night, searching for any sign of her son. The townspeople whispered about her, about the crazy woman who lost her mind after her son disappeared. But they didn't understand. They hadn't seen what she had seen. One night, as she sat alone in the darkened park, she heard it again, Danny's laughter, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the old well at the park's edge, a place long forgotten and overgrown with weeds. Emily approached the well, her hands trembling. She peered into the darkness, and there, far below, she saw them, two glowing eyes staring back at her. "Danny?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The laughter stopped. The eyes blinked once, twice, and then a voice, low and distorted, echoed up from the depths. "Come down, Mom. Let's have some fun." Emily knew it wasn't her son, but she didn't care. She climbed over the edge of the well, her heart pounding in her chest. She would go wherever Danny was, even if it meant following him into the abyss. As she descended into the darkness, the last thing she heard was the sound of Mr. Jingles's laughter, echoing through the void. The well swallowed her whole, and the park was silent once more. The next morning, Riverside was quiet, as it always was. The sun rose over the town, casting its golden light on the park. The well stood at its edge, forgotten and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever happened. But if you listened closely, you could still hear the faintest sound of laughter, carried on the wind, a reminder that some games never end, and that Mr. Jingles was always waiting for his next player.